Thank you, everyone. This is Intersections, and I'm Connie Ryan. I'm the Executive Director of Interfaith Alliance of Iowa, and I'm really glad that you have joined us here today. We're going to be talking about religion, the impact of religion on voting behavior, and we have with us Bruce NESMITH, who is Professor of Political Science at Coe College, and Bruce is going to talk with us about that intersection of religion and politics, and it's always interesting to have the combination of the two, but also specifically about voting behavior. And so I'm really glad that you are joining us today, Bruce. And I know you are dealing with COVID, but I'm glad that you're able to be with us on Zoom. And thank you to everyone who signed up and for your flexibility and patience with us. And Bruce, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me to do this talk, and thanks for accommodating my microbial needs. I only feel bad that for having people lose their lunch, hopefully not literally, but you had to find your own lunch.
Yeah.
This is a topic that has interested me a long time. I professional career during the Reagan presidency, and it really was that era, the 1980s and the Reagan era, that created the political alignments that we live with today. There have been a few alterations in the Trump era, but we're still pretty much living in Reagan's world. And one of the developments during that period was the increasing importance of religious doctrine in affecting political behavior. Prior to that, for most of the 20th century, Protestants and Catholics were the predominant kind of understanding of how political differences worked, but for reasons that we'll talk about in a little bit, for reasons that weren't necessarily linked to their doctrine. Feelings of distinction, yes. Feelings of commonality within the group, yes, but not necessarily issues of how they understood religious matters. So I was clever enough to pick up on that early. I was not clever enough to pick up or to articulate it very well. So I have a very old book that came out of my dissertation, which I'm not going to tell you any more about, but it did kind of get into some of this. Since then, I've done research on lots of different things, none of which related to this. So most of this comes out of class notes, heavily indebted to Kenneth Wald for the scheme that I'm using. He was a professor at University of Florida back in the 80s who published one of the books on religion and politics in the United States that is still in print, and his name's still on it. I don't know how much work he's still doing on it. And the data mostly come from the Pew Forum, which does a massive study of religious belief that includes religion's intersection with politics. And I have sent that link as well as my email address to Connie and Kristen. So if anybody wants to talk to me more about this or wants to investigate the data, the website is very user-friendly, and there's lots of different ways to mix and match the data, so you can really play around with it. So I want to start with a big question, get into reduce it to a multiple choice question, and then in about 20 minutes, I'll go through some of the major religious groups in the United States and give some what I think are pretty plausible answers to this question. That may be as good as we can get in the social sciences in the absence of experimental conditions. So this is Wald's work, and he talks about 3 faces of religion. It actually winds up being about 4 or 5 once he starts explaining it out. But if you think about the question, why would a group of people identified with some kind of common and that these definitions are really broad, why would a group of people with some broad commonality in religious leaning tend to vote and be allied with a political party in similar ways? And there's probably three ways of answering that. One is that they would have similar beliefs in their religion that would tie into politics, belief on abortion, or belief on human rights, or belief on in terms of Sunday observance, or whatever common beliefs they would have. They would take that into the political realm and try to see those reflected in public policy. There's a slight distinction which also comes from Wald, which I think is worth making because we might need it later. Some religions have pretty explicit articles of faith. Others do not. My own faith, the United Methodist Church, has a book called The Social Principles, and we only bring it out every once in a while when we want to change something. And so I think most Methodists can go through an entire religious life without really engaging much with the social principles. So for us, to the extent that our faith is going to influence our political leanings, it's probably not going to be specific articles of faith so much as some kind of generalized understanding of the role of the religious believer in the world. So that's one. You could go directly from beliefs, either specific or general, to political beliefs. Another is that the group may have some common attribute which isn't necessarily religious. For example, the group might be unusually wealthy. The Episcopal Church is the wealthiest denomination in terms of personal per capita income in the United States. That might make them more inclined to support political parties that defend the economic interests of the wealthy. It doesn't particularly, but it probably used to. Other groups might be unusually composed of poor people, or immigrants, or social outcasts, or something like that. So their social positions leads them to take political position, and these also happen to have similar religious beliefs. The third is the people may be members of a denomination or an organization that has specific interests apart from spreading the gospel. For example, Roman Catholics have for nearly 200 years, I think about 180 years, had an extensive set of K-12 schools in the United States that in many areas of the country rivals or exceeds the public schools. So they have, apart from their specific beliefs and apart from whatever social characteristics they share in common, they might have interest in defending their ability to run a private school system. So creed, social group, institution, those are pretty much going to be the answer. Whatever it is we're talking about, whatever group it is we're talking about, we're going to try to have to explain their behavior in one of those three ways. A caution, which you probably already knew about, but I'll mention anyway. If you are part of a house of worship, if you regularly attend a church or a synagogue or a mosque, you are certainly aware of diversity within your group. Even if it's a small group, you're certainly aware of diversity within that group. So you can question, gosh, if my little church has so many different viewpoints represented, how is it that if we expand this to the national level and draw in other faith groups that have similar beliefs, how could we possibly get any kind of direction out of this at all? And the fact is that there is diversity, which we're going to mention right now and then probably ignore for the rest of the 20 minutes. in terms of diversity, internal diversity within the religious groups. So if we take, this is the voting data from 2020, but if we take a group like Black Protestants, 91% of Black Protestants in the Pew survey voted for Joe Biden, which means that 9% voted for Donald Trump in the two-party vote. 84% of white evangelical Protestants voted for Donald Trump, which means that 15, thanks to rounding, 15% voted for Joe Biden. So even in groups that are heavily politically leaning to one direction or another, there are people who within that group who don't go along with that leaning. All right, with that out of the way, in we plunge. And I have these in no particular order. I'm going to try to take them from left to right, but we'll see how well that works. So the most consistently Democratic supporting group in the broad set of American religious families is Black Protestants. And so we can look at what happened over time. We have a long period, of course, where Blacks were excluded from voting, either by quasi-legal means or quasi-violent means. But by the 1960s, they had emerged as a group that voted more or less in terms of political participation on par with whites. At the same time, in the 1960s, they went from a predominantly Democratic group, like think maybe Hispanics today, to an overwhelmingly Democratic group, and they have remained so for the last 60 years. They have also, I think, partly because of the generation of the civil rights movement, become more oriented to politics than previously had been the case. Both Black and white evangelicals, for most of the 20th century, did not participate in politics. It was widely criticized from the pulpit. And in fact, people like Martin Luther King among Black evangelicals, or Jerry Falwell among white evangelicals, were criticized by fellow pastors for just even doing anything other than saving souls, getting people to heaven. But the civil rights movement, for a lot of Black churches, tended to legitimize involvement in politics, and it tended heavily to be on the Democratic Party side, and continues to be so today. Partly, probably mostly, because of Black status as an out group, and for most of the Democratic Party's history, it's even back into the 1820s and 30s when they were founded, they tended to be the party that represented less elite interests. So that would be how we would explain Black political behavior, with understanding that there's a lot of diversity within that group. Second most left is Jewish voters. So Blacks in 2020 were 9% for Trump, and I don't have the Jewish numbers here, but they have tended to run in about the 15 to 25% range for Republicans, with the rest of the two-party vote going for Democratic. Here is an interesting case where the overall wealth of the group would tend to incline them more to an elite party political activity, but social group status has, at least historically, inclined them to be more democratic, and that has continued even as Jewish people over the generations, maybe over the last 75 years, have become more integrated into American society than they were, and even as issues of Israel and Palestine have become front and center in American foreign policy. Republicans tending to take a stronger line in favor of Israel. Concerns about the agenda of the Christian right, the domestic agenda of the Christian right, and also at least in some synagogues, a creed that favors social involvement and public activity and support for the poor and the weak. So those would be a couple of groups that are decidedly on the left. In the middle are Catholics, almost exactly, typically running almost exactly 50-50, Republican versus Democrat. If you're Catholic, if you know any Catholics, you probably know that covers a wide diversity within the denomination. As we say in the social sciences, it's a mean of 0.5 and a standard deviation of a pretty great deal. Even mid-century Roman Catholic, the public face of Roman Catholicism included people who were from Eastern European backgrounds and were staunchly anti-communist, as well as the Catholic worker folks like Dorothy Day, who were very deeply into aggressive promotion of social welfare programs. So you wind up with pretty much 50-50. That's what they were in the two-party vote in 2020, and that's not unusual. What's changed since the days of Dorothy Day and Francis Cardinal Spellman is that Catholics definitely have been incorporated into the American social fabric, and they're not typically as distinct as even I can remember when I was younger. The very prominent role of the U.S. Council on Catholic Bishops, I would say, equal to or greater than the Church and Society on the Protestant side, includes strong statements in favor of social welfare and destruction of nuclear weapons and economic equality, as well as very conservative statements on abortion and sex education and support for private schools. More recent surveys have shown a distinction between white Catholics and Hispanic Catholics, although not huge. The overall white Catholics were 57% for Trump in 2020. Hispanic Catholics, I've lost them, but the overall Catholic was 50%. So you probably would say that Hispanic Catholics were probably in the mid-30s. So more Republican than blacks, maybe less Republican than Hispanic Pentecostals, but definitely more Democratic than white Catholics. Also in the middle, coming from the other direction, are mainline Protestants. This is a term which we could spend probably you should get Gary Connors-Bowe or Peter Yahwanan to wax eloquent on this. I did waste a lot of my youth trying to come up with a measure that would get a doctrinal difference between a mainline Protestant and an evangelical Protestant. Most surveys, including the Pew survey, which you'd think would have resources to do whatever they wanted to, most surveys just use denominational affiliation, and it seems to work pretty well. So mainline Protestants are theologically, biblically liberal, less strict about the meaning or literal truth of Scripture. They also tend to be the oldest and wealthiest churches. So United Presbyterians, United Methodists, Evangelical Lutherans, United Church of Christ, Disciples of Christ, Episcopal, and often included are American Baptists. They were 57% for, they're predominantly white in most parts of the country. They were 57% for Trump in 2020. Trump is an odd bird in a lot of ways, but this is pretty typical even going back to the 80s. So not that much different than you would have seen from a more normal Republican like Romney or one of the Bushes. This is a big change. Mainline Protestants were heavily Republican through most of the 20th century. They were what kept the Republican Party alive during the days of the New Deal and the Fair Deal. But they are probably, I would say, more libertarian. So wealthy, but libertarian. And so I think the response, the move to the center has come in response to a more aggressive use of government offered by evangelicals on things like abortion and private schools, things like that. And then on the right, I left out a left group. This is a group that we did not talk about in the 80s because they were, I guess, not on our radar screen, but they're on our radar screen now, which is the unaffiliated, which includes people who are decidedly atheist or agnostic, as well as people who just don't spend enough time in their life thinking about religion to know what religion they are. And they are a heavily Democratic group. The unaffiliated was 26% for Trump in 2020. This is partly due to the atheists and agnostics who are decidedly Democratic. Their support for Trump was much lower than people who are unaffiliated. The true unaffiliated probably aren't particularly politically affiliated either. That's not necessarily true, but it does seem to coincide. They also have, unaffiliated people also have very liberal views on most political issues, but particularly the social issues on which the evangelicals have been galvanized. And then that leaves us with white evangelical Protestants. Race is, I think, becoming less of a segregating factor in religion these days, but it remains one in terms of religious traditions. And I will say the first time I ran a statistical number crunching thing, trying to figure out evangelicals and mainlines on support for Reagan and Carter, I was shocked to find how many evangelicals were supporting Carter and even Mondale. Well, it's because they didn't separate out race. So we separate the whites and the blacks. Most black Protestants are evangelical, so are most Hispanic Protestants, but white evangelicals have a different orientation. Historically, as I said, low political involvement because of their historic low economic status and because of their predominance in the South, where the Democratic Party was still the party of the Confederacy up until the 1960s. They tended to be Democratic historically, shifted heavily Republican over maybe a 20-year period from maybe the late 50s to the late 70s, but subsequent to that have been a large and a decidedly Republican religious group. Mostly, well, there's lots of different ways of looking at it. I think certainly you have the creation in the South of a network of private schools in the wake of desegregation that were mostly religious, so they had institutional interests. Group status, that's a funny thing because they tend to think of themselves as an outgroup. And so in theory, that would lead them to vote for the Democratic Party, and that was actually true for most of the 20th century. but what goes on in the 70s and 80s as evangelical political activity becomes more assertive is that they run against a lot of the powerful Democratic groups, from blacks to white liberals to intellectuals to lots of people. Pretty much, but mostly probably overt creed is probably the biggest explanation here. I would say that was also true of unaffiliated, but how can you have a creed if you're unaffiliated? But definitely true for evangelical Protestants and the very specific claims that are made about the role of religion in politics, the policies that from abortion to support for Israel that are central to a lot of evangelicals' public face. So those are, that's a whip through the American religious families. As I say, if you'd like to spend more time with that, the Pew Forum stuff is online and it's really easy to move around and play with. I will say one more thing since I've got 2 minutes. There is a division within a lot of the groups, not all of them, but a division within a lot of the groups in terms of active participation and inactive participation. And so the Pew data that I have splits it out at monthly. Do you attend religious services at least monthly? And those who attend religious services at least monthly, regardless of religious group, voted in favor of Trump in 2020 by 59 to 41, leaving out the minor candidates, just looking at the two-party vote. Those people who attended church less than monthly, if at all, voted for Biden by 60 to 40. So almost a mirror image there. That is an interesting phenomenon. I will say, though, it can be overdone. It is pretty much a phenomenon that is limited to white people. That if you factor out non-white people, that the tendency becomes greater. But if you look specifically at non-white people, religiously active people tend to be at least as democratic as less religiously active people. So for blacks and Hispanic Catholics, it tends to have a reinforcing effect rather than or at least a democratic effect rather than a Republican effect. So that is my scamper through the data. I'd be happy to go back over some of this stuff, or perhaps you have specific questions that I can try to answer.
Thank you so much, Bruce. It really is fascinating information, and it's interesting to see the range of it and where folks lie in that. We're gonna open it up for questions, and so you can do that one of two ways. You can write your question in the chat, or you can go to the reactions button at the bottom of your screen and raise your virtual hand, so to speak. I won't be able to see you if you're raising your actual hand. I won't be able to see you. So you have to go to reactions and click raise hand, and then I'll be able to see you. And I see Bob Rush has his virtual hand up, so I'm going to unmute him. Bob, you have to accept my ask to unmute, and then we'll be able to hear you. There you go.
Thank you, Bruce. Thank you. Very, very informative. And during your research, any connections that one could draw from Iowa moving from fairly purple state to a red state and the religious activities in the state?
Not from this. There may be some religious immigration and outmigration that has affected Iowa's voting. But I would interpret it differently, just as well as I can, without the benefit of specific survey data. I think that what's gone on in Iowa really is two things. As you go back to the 80s, and prior to the 80s, Iowa was pretty reliably Republican state, albeit a moderate Republican state. And so there was the salience of the family farm issue and the loss of the family farms that shifted Iowa Democratic in at least some elections beginning in 1988. I think what's going on in 2014 and after is maybe a change in which issues are salient. So the framing of elections are different. It's weird for me to say, well, that in an election in which Barack Obama was one of the candidates, that race was not particularly salient, but I think race has become a lot more salient in Iowa elections post 2012, and probably nationally as well. So people think about themselves, they think of themselves as their racial identification when they're participating in politics.
Thanks for the question, Bob. In the chat, Bruce, we have a couple of questions already. Harry asked, where are the Muslims? And I would add to that.
Let's talk about that.
Yeah, and any of the smaller religious groups.
Yeah. The increase in non-European immigration, beginning with the Immigration Act of, I think, 1964-65, has really changed the American religious landscape in a way that that scholars are having a hard time keeping up with. The data, the data I'm looking right now lump lots of groups in together. So you get Hindu, Buddhist, Muslim, Jewish, Christian Scientist. You get lots of groups that really don't fit together in a kind of a miscellaneous way. The Muslims, like Hispanic Protestants, which is kind of a strange comparison, but I will push forward. And indeed, maybe some Black Protestants are a group that theologically are pretty conservative. They're at least their public face in America among observant Muslims is one of the more stricter, and it only gets worse from here. One of the stricter religious groups. So that would incline them perhaps to be more Republican. However, their position in American society, particularly in the wake of 9/11, but even before that, has had to be very defensive. That they have been the subject of a lot of verbal attacks and probably the extreme version would be President Trump's 3 attempts to bar various forms of Muslim immigration. So the tendency has been to the extent they don't because of their numbers, they don't show up a lot in polls. I think the Muslim proportion in America is probably about 2%. So they don't show up as much in polls, but to the extent like Pew will do some deeper dives and get bigger sets of smaller groups, seem to be inclined more to be Democratic.
Thanks. We have a question from Dennis Goldford, who is your colleague across the state at Drake University. And he writes, I apologize if I missed your mentioning this, but can you talk about the new Apostolic Reformation group whose goal is essentially to re-Christianize the US? What do you see as their strengths and weaknesses? It's connected to so-called dominionism with roots in Rushdoony's Reconstructionism.
Okay. And I have no excuse for ignorance on this because Dennis thoughtfully sent me an article about this earlier, but I didn't read it. So I'm going to speak to that in a very general way, not to the specific claimants. I am familiar with the Christian Reconstructionist movement, which goes back into the 70s and 80s, and there's some really interesting characters there. They tend not to catch a lot of fire. They tend to be too rigid even for the mainstream of the Republican Party. So to the extent that they can create alliances with white evangelical Protestants, they can get some favorable public policies passed. But we are very far from any kind of conversation about whether America is legally, doctrinally a Christian nation. I will try to salvage myself here by mentioning that Dennis has a very good book out on this, which he will perhaps thoughtfully put the title and publisher in the chat. It's been out about 10 years, and I've taught it a couple of times. My own feeling is that the decline of evangelicals as a proportion of the American population, combined with the rise of the unaffiliated, has led evangelicals to be less aggressive about establishing some form of Christian America, and more in terms of defending their own turf. So it's less, we're the moral majority and we're going to tell you how you should live your life, than we are meek religious believers and you can't make us give our employees health insurance or whatever else that we don't want to do.
Thanks. Nancy writes, do you have statistics on the issue of abortion in these different groups?
Yes, I don't have them in front of me, but I'm pretty sure that Pew has some good data that you can get on. So I'm going to do this from memory, which is always dangerous. The Protestant Catholic divide on abortion is that there isn't one, that their views are pretty much the same. The percentages are pretty much the same. One complication with reading abortion data is that it's not an either or situation. There typically are middle options where most Americans, at least historically, I think maybe less so now, but most Americans, at least historically, preferred one of the middle options, which meant that abortion was legal under certain circumstances. For certain reasons, abortion was allowed. And so those wind up, because they're not fully one or the other, they wind up getting classified in all kinds of different ways. But I would say that white evangelical Protestants are the most opposed to abortion, and that Jews and probably mainline Protestants are the most supportive of abortions happening, and the other groups kind of in the middle. So for some groups, this is a very salient issue, important. It's social science talk for important. It's a very important issue, and for others, it isn't. I think particularly, it's not a voting issue. For example, for Black Protestants who are, probably more pro-life than white mainline Protestants, but it's not a voting issue for them, or they'd be more Republican.
Charles asks, you mentioned we are still living in the Reagan era, but has changed a little bit in the Trump era. How has it changed?
It's pretty subtly, I would say, um, that white college educated people typically were pretty Republican, although there always has been throughout the Reagan era, there's been a distinction between white people with a bachelor's degree, with a four-year degree, and white people with more than a four-year degree, which tended to be very democratic. And so it's this weird sort of line that you could draw on a graph where white people with a graduate degree tended to be about as democratic as white people with no college education. Or sorry, with no, without a high school diploma is what I meant to say. So there seems to be some democratic inroads in the group, in the higher educated white group, and Republican inroads in the lower educated white group. But it's pretty subtle. I think if you looked at numbers from the election of '88 with Bush and Dukakis, they don't look that different from one of the Trump elections.
I'll just remind folks, you can either raise your virtual hand going down to reactions at the bottom of your screen, or you can put your questions or comments in the chat. Just to illuminate a little bit more on what you were speaking about with abortion, Dennis wrote in the chat, Dennis Goldford, when Roe v. Wade came down in 1973 and Baptists were asked about it, they said they didn't care. It was a Catholic issue. What changed was the Republican introduction of culture war issues in 1980, when abortion began to be used to unite Northern urban ethnic Catholics with white Southern rural Protestants. So I think that's an interesting, your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think to go back to my three-part, I see Wald's, I just borrowed it for the day. Looking at creed and social group and institutional interest, it is really kind of hard to distinguish with any precision a creedal position from a position of identity, which would be probably more social group. So it's some sound better than others.
Go ahead and put your questions in the chat if you want. I'll ask a question of you, Bruce. So looking toward the future, we know that the what is commonly referred to as the nuns, and not N-U-N-S, but N-O-N-E-S for folks, is a growing group and is nearly the majority, if not past the majority now, of Americans and voters. How do you see the future playing out of these divides, but including particularly the nuns in voting patterns?
The difficulty is that humans, we're dealing with humans. If we were dealing with molecules, I think the direction is pretty clear. Nearly all groups in the American population that are growing in proportion are Democratic groups, and the groups that tend to be shrinking in proportion tend to be Republican groups. I think there tends to be among Democrats, at least in the long run, the view that we just need to wait for a few people to die and a few people to immigrate, and we'll just be muddling through to victory. But parties are adaptable. One reason that this story began is that Republicans had held through the New Deal era onto a fairly small, economically and politically powerful, but numerically small number of elites, upper incomes, upper education, and got numerically swamped by Democrats on a fairly regular basis, unless they ran somebody like Dwight Eisenhower. So it was the Republicans' adaptation in the 70s and 80s that brought us to where we are today. So my thought is that if nothing else changed and Republicans were willing to be drubbed in every election, then that would probably happen fairly soon. But probably there will be some adaptation. So whatever I predict will be wrong anyway.
Somewhat related, Karen notes, perhaps when people of any religious background come face to face with a decision about reproductive health care and find themselves thwarted by legislative or judicial bodies, if it's not too late, they'll change their own stance views on abortion, specifically from the religious sphere to the political. I think it's an interesting.
Yeah, one area that has borne this out in remarkable. So one reason why biologists study genetics people study fruit flies is they have generations so quickly. And the closest we've got, I think, to that kind of phenomenon in American politics is the dramatic change in acceptance and then in support for the rights of gays and lesbians. I was trying to dig up some numbers from '88 so I could impress you with how similar they were to 2020, and I couldn't quite come up with some the right bunch, but I did find a poll on gay marriage from 1988, and pretty much nobody liked it, and now it's mainstream, and the difference is that at a certain level of visibility, everybody realizes they know somebody who's gay or lesbian. And I think that people who are in favor of legal abortion have been trying to attain that same level of visibility. We know they happen, but what we don't know is necessarily how many people we know have been faced with that situation. So the polling on abortion has changed more slowly, but certainly in some of the polls that I've seen, certainly they definitely tilt to the more rights or pro-choice side, particularly if you include limited levels of restrictions. So that remains possible. Certainly in 2022, Republicans paid a political price for the Dobbs decision. Whether that will continue to be the case, I'm kind of talking around the question rather than answering it. But one of the interesting things that people have observed is how many elections prior to 2022, prior to the Dobbs decision, Democrats raised the issue of the courts and said that if you vote Republican, then Republican presidents will appoint conservative justices who will eventually undo Roe versus Wade, and that didn't seem to move many votes. But in 2022, the incidence of it actually happening was a difficult one for Republicans, and they're still struggling with it.
Yeah, I think the other thing to note on that is you were talking about people having more knowledge from 1988 to now on marriage equality, and with access to safe and legal abortion. It's also a growing body of information and personal knowledge on the scope of what abortion means. It's not just the person who's 18 who finds herself pregnant and decides to have an abortion, but people have a better understanding now on the range of reasons that someone chooses to have an abortion, or really medically has to have an abortion. So I think that is a healthy thing for our society to have a better understanding of what that is.
Certainly, there are a lot of stories out there. To what extent they have impacted people's knowledge level so I want to see some data before I was too confident about that.
Sure. Charles asks, You did not mention Catholic social teachings. They tend to be more liberal than the Catholic Church. Could you talk a little bit about those teachings?
I think I will punt on that one.
Okay.
The anytime you get a large group, Catholics at least are under the same denominational umbrella. All these other groups we're talking about are pretty much under multiple denominational umbrellas that aren't always well coordinated. But you are getting a lot of messages. And I think whatever group you're in, but I think particularly in a group as diverse as the Roman Catholic Church in America, you can pretty much pick what you want to pay attention to also. So you can focus on abortion and private schools, and a lot of Catholics do, but you can also focus on the many teachings that are out there from the bishops or from smaller groups that not smaller groups, but less lower in the hierarchy. Then there's a lot of social action out there as well.
Absolutely. I don't see any more questions. There's a few comments, but I don't see any. Oh, hold on. We have one more. Speaking about the impact of personal connections and knowledge of LGBTQ plus and pregnancy complications, I always remember a Missouri senator displaying his ignorance about rape when he said a person wouldn't become pregnant if it was legitimate rape because her body would reject the sperm. I do remember that. It was a few years ago. So, and then Nancy talks about the importance of education on that subject. I'll wait just a second to see if there's any more questions in the chat on the topic of voting behavior. Harry asked, what about the impact of the media?
That's a good question. It's another thing I haven't studied in a long time. One thing that is certainly true is the diversity of channels that are out there, and the diversity of ways that people can get information about public affairs or choose not to. But I think that what that does is enable people to choose what the tone of the information they receive in a way that they didn't have that same choice maybe 40 years ago, before the rise of cable, and particularly the cable news giants. So I would say the media, the greatest impact of the media would be in reinforcing what Wald calls an implicit creed or worldview, that you could choose a news source that would be consistent with your religious worldview or your whole set of values, and that they could raise issues or lower issues in ways that were consistent. We're reinforcing that in a way that mainstream media weren't necessarily doing 40 years ago.
Yeah, most definitely. Dennis added alternative religious media are a big deal. Pat Robertson started that, though there has always been preachers who purchase broadcast time on both radio and TV, and that certainly is the case and has certainly expanded as well. Kristen is gonna put Bruce's email in the chat again, just so that you all have it. And Bruce, if they want to contact you, they can get information from you.
Yeah.
Talk a little about that. Talk a little bit about what they can reach out for the information that you.
I can send you my notes from this presentation, which are kind of restructured lecture notes. I can send you the link to the data that I used. There may be some other links that I have. I haven't taught this. I taught religion, U.S. politics at Co for a number of years, most recently, I think in like 2017 or something like that. So I've not taught or studied this. So if your question begins with, have you looked at, the answer probably is going to be no. That I tend to put a lot of my energies in different areas of the political world these days. But I'd be happy to chat about anything. It remains interesting to me. I'm just not as probably deeply informed on it as I was, well, maybe 30 years ago.
Well, you seemed very informed to us, and lots of notes of thanks in the chat, and for all of the information. So I'm going to wrap things up. Thank you, everyone who is on with us. Sorry about the technical difficulties that we had at the beginning of the program, but glad you stuck with us. We're glad you're here. Next time for Intersections, we are going to talk about water quality and agriculture in Iowa. We have Chris Jones, who's the retired research engineer from the University of Iowa, who was in the news for a while. And so Chris will be joining us hopefully in person and hopefully back at St. Paul's. And we'll get that information out to everyone as soon as we can. So we're glad you're with us, and we will say goodbye for now and have a great weekend. Thank you all. Thank you, Bruce.
Thanks, everybody.